73 seconds. That's all it took, from liftoff to the loss of 7 lives. Not in deep space, not beyond reach or understanding, but in full view of the world, broadcast live to millions, including school children who had gathered to watch one of their own travel into orbit. The Space Shuttle Challenger was one of the most tragic accidents in space exploration. It broke apart in a fireball at nearly twice the speed of sound, 46,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean on a cold morning in January 1986. In those 73 seconds, the perception of spaceflight shifted. What had come to be seen as routine revealed its underlying risk. This is the story of what happened. More importantly, it's the story of what was known beforehand and what was set aside. The mission was designated STS-51L. It was Challenger's 10th flight and the 25th mission of the Space Shuttle program. By 1986, NASA had settled into a steady pace. Launches, once rare and uncertain, were beginning to feel almost routine, both to the public and within the agency. The shuttle had become a working vehicle, relied upon to deliver payloads and support scientific research. The crew reflected that sense of purpose. Commander Francis Dick Scobie was an experienced test pilot and Air Force officer who had previously flown Challenger. Pilot Michael Smith, a naval aviator and engineer, was on his first mission. Mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair were accomplished astronauts and scientists, each with prior spaceflight experience. Resnick was the second American woman in space. Onizuka was the first Asian American astronaut. McNair was the second African American to fly in space. Payload specialist Gregory Jarvis represented Hughes Aircraft and the satellite program the mission was intended to support. Then there was Krista McAuliffe. She was a social studies teacher from New Hampshire, selected through the nationwide Teacher in Space program. She was scheduled to deliver 2 lessons from orbit, broadcast to classrooms across the country. Her motto captured her role. I touch the future, I teach. Her presence made STS-51L different. Schools organized viewings. Students gathered around televisions. Families watched together. NASA had, deliberately and understandably, presented the launch as a moment of shared national pride. McAuliffe represented the idea that spaceflight could extend beyond professional astronauts, that it could belong to ordinary citizens. That context shaped the impact of January the 28th, 1986. Challenger had been scheduled to launch on January 22nd, but was delayed several times due to weather. By the evening of January 27th, the night before the final attempt, serious concerns were being raised out of public view and not fully understood across NASA's leadership. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the solid rocket boosters, were troubled by the forecast. The boosters were built in segments, joined and sealed by rubber O-rings designed to contain high-pressure gases during launch. These components were classified as Criticality 1, meaning their failure could lead to catastrophic loss of the vehicle. That risk was already known. What concerned the engineers was temperature. They had observed that cold conditions reduced the flexibility of the O-rings. Previous missions had shown signs of erosion. At lower temperatures, the risk increased significantly. Their data suggested that below about 53 degrees Fahrenheit or 12 degrees Celsius, the seals might not perform as intended. On the morning of January the 28th, temperatures at Kennedy Space Center were near freezing, the coldest launch conditions the shuttle program had experienced. The night before, Thiokol engineers presented their concerns during a teleconference with NASA officials. They recommended delaying the launch. They outlined the data and the potential consequences. What followed would later be examined in detail by the Rogers Commission, the panel appointed to investigate the disaster. Thiokol's management, under pressure from NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, reversed the engineers' recommendation and approved the launch. The engineers who objected were overruled. Crucially, senior NASA managers responsible for the final launch decision were not informed that there had been significant internal opposition. The concerns were raised, debated, and ultimately set aside before reaching the full chain of decision-makers. The Rogers Commission later concluded that if all relevant information had been available, it was highly unlikely the launch would have proceeded under those conditions. But approval had been given. And the next morning, at 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Challenger lifted off from Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center. As the engines ignited and the shuttle climbed into a clear winter sky, the crew could not have known that the outcome had, in effect, already been determined before the launch began. To those watching, families at the site, students gathered around televisions, and millions across the country, it appeared routine, just like any other launch. The ascent was powerful, controlled, and familiar. What the cameras also captured, though not widely understood at the time, was an early sign of failure. At 0.678 seconds after liftoff, a brief puff of black smoke appeared near the aft joint of the right solid rocket booster. It indicated that hot gas was already escaping past the O-ring seal. The rubber, stiffened by the cold, had not sealed properly. The joint was compromised from the start. For the next 72 seconds, Challenger continued its ascent. The shuttle completed its roll program. Engine thrust increased to 104%, then briefly reduced as the vehicle passed through maximum aerodynamic pressure. Telemetry indicated normal performance. To mission control, to the crew, and to observers on the ground, the flight appeared normal. Inside the orbiter, there were small, routine exchanges. Around 15 seconds into flight, mission specialist Judy Resnick was heard to remark, "Hot," a detail that only gained meaning later. By 19 seconds, Challenger remained on a standard trajectory. There was no clear indication to the crew that anything was wrong. At 73 seconds after liftoff, telemetry recorded a sudden drop in liquid oxygen pressure. It was the first clear instrument reading that the situation had become critical. Pilot Michael Smith's voice was captured on the cockpit recorder. His final words were brief. "Uh-oh." 1 second later, the shuttle broke apart. At approximately 73 seconds, the primary O-ring in the aft field joint of the right solid rocket booster failed completely. The secondary seal failed immediately afterward. With both seals compromised, superheated gases escaped the booster. A jet of flame, initially difficult to distinguish against the brightness of the engines, burned through the joint and struck the adjacent external tank. The aft dome of the hydrogen tank failed. Liquid hydrogen leaked and ignited, followed by the rupture of the liquid oxygen tank. Within moments, the entire structure of the external tank was lost. The right solid rocket booster, no longer structurally constrained, pivoted inward and collided with the tank. Challenger, traveling at Mach 1.92, was exposed to forces it could not withstand. Ground cameras recorded a rapidly expanding cloud of propellant. Flames merged into a large, bright fireball that engulfed the orbiter. The vehicle separated into multiple sections. One wing was visible falling away from the plume. The two solid rocket boosters, now detached, continued on uncontrolled paths before being destroyed by the range safety officer. By 75 seconds after launch, all telemetry had ceased. Challenger was destroyed. Mission Control recognized the event almost immediately. A statement was issued that the vehicle had apparently exploded. Shuttle operations were suspended. The final radio transmission from Challenger had been recorded at 74.13 seconds after liftoff, just before breakup. After that, there was no further communication. When the Challenger broke apart, it did not explode in the conventional sense. The structural failure caused the orbiter to disintegrate under aerodynamic forces, but the crew cabin separated largely intact and continued upward, reaching an altitude of approximately 65,000 feet before arcing back down toward the ocean. The forces at the moment of breakup, while violent, were estimated to be between 12 and 20 Gs, dropping to near freefall within seconds. Forces that investigators concluded were probably not sufficient to cause death or serious injury. Key evidence recovered afterward showed that personal egress air packs had been manually activated for at least 3 of the 7 crew members, something that could not have happened without conscious action from someone on board. This strongly indicates that at least some of the crew survived the initial breakup. Whether they remained conscious throughout the approximately 2.5-minute fall or lost consciousness due to possible cabin depressurization cannot be determined. The crew cabin struck the Atlantic Ocean at unsurvivable speed, and it was the recovery of that wreckage that confirmed much of what we know. Search parties eventually located the cabin on the ocean floor, roughly 100 feet down, and it was the physical evidence found there, including the activated air packs and the position of certain cockpit switches, that led investigators to their conclusions about the crew's condition after the breakup. NASA's official report acknowledged that the ocean impact was so violent it masked much of the forensic evidence from the preceding minutes, which is why the exact cause and precise moment of death were ultimately ruled inconclusive. 7 people were killed. The Teacher in Space program ended. The event became the most widely witnessed disaster in the history of spaceflight. On February 3, 1986, President Ronald Reagan appointed a 13-member investigative panel, later known as the Rogers Commission. Chaired by former Secretary of State William Rogers, the commission conducted extensive interviews, held dozens of hearings, and reviewed all available data. Its technical conclusion was clear. The loss of Challenger resulted from the failure of a joint in the right solid rocket booster. The O-ring seals were breached by hot gases. No other system was identified as a contributing cause. The failure was specific, identifiable, and, as the investigation showed, foreseeable. The commission also examined the decisions leading up to the launch. It confirmed that engineers at Morton Tiacol had recommended against launching on January 28th due to low temperatures. They presented data outlining the risks to O-ring performance and stated that conditions were outside their acceptable limits. Their recommendation was overruled by management. The investigation further found that senior NASA officials involved in the launch decision were not informed of this objection. The concern was raised and resolved within the Tiacol-Marshall discussion and was not communicated further. As a result, those responsible for the final decision did not have access to critical information. William Rogers later stated that NASA's decision-making process had been definitely flawed. The commission concluded that the launch decision itself was flawed and that, had all relevant information been available, it is highly unlikely the launch would have proceeded. Physicist Richard Feynman, a member of the commission, offered a direct assessment in his appendix to the report. For successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. The Rogers Commission released its final report on June 6, 1986. It included 9 primary recommendations. These addressed the redesign of the solid rocket booster joints, the creation of independent oversight for critical systems, and a comprehensive review of all Criticality 1 components. The report also called for structural changes within NASA, including the establishment of an independent Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance reporting directly to the administrator. Additional recommendations focused on shuttle operations, including landing safety, crew escape provisions, and flight scheduling. On June 13th, President Reagan directed NASA Administrator James Fletcher to implement the recommendations. NASA initiated a series of changes, including a complete redesign of the solid rocket booster joints and the restructuring of its safety organization. New launch review procedures were introduced, and modifications were made to improve crew safety systems. All shuttle flights were suspended. The program remained grounded for 32 months. On September 29, 1988, the Space Shuttle Discovery launched on mission STS-26, marking the return to flight. NASA had undertaken an extensive review process before resuming operations. The length of the suspension reflected the scope of the changes and the need to restore confidence in the program. The shuttle program continued, completing 111 missions in total, including 26 after Challenger. The changes implemented after STS-51L shaped subsequent operations, influencing both hardware design and safety procedures. Those measures would later be reassessed following the loss of Columbia in 2003. All 7 crew members were posthumously awarded the Congressional Space Medal of Honor. Memorials, educational programs, and institutions were established in their names. The Challenger Center network continued the educational mission associated with Krista McAuliffe. At the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, the Forever Remembered Memorial, opened in 2016, preserves artifacts from both Challenger and Columbia. NASA continues to observe an annual Day of Remembrance. Krista McAuliffe's words, "I touch the future. I teach," remain closely associated with the mission. She did not reach orbit or deliver the lessons she had prepared, but her role in the program left a lasting mark on how spaceflight is understood by the public. President Reagan, addressing the nation on the evening of the disaster, spoke of the crew's commitment and the meaning of their work. He described them as individuals who accepted risk in pursuit of exploration and emphasized that they would be remembered. The Challenger disaster continues to be studied in engineering, management, and public policy. It is often cited as a case in which technical failure and organizational breakdown occurred together. The failure of the O-ring was the immediate cause, but it occurred within a broader context of miscommunication, incomplete information, and decision-making under pressure. 73 seconds. 7 lives. An event that remains central to understanding the risks of exploration and the responsibility that accompanies it.